There is much suffering and misery on this planet, and at some point we come to the question, where does all this come from? Did God create evil? And if so, why? Welcome to Spirita Vivo.
There are various theories about whether and why God or a higher power created evil in religious and spiritual teachings. They may all have their justification in their way. In today's podcast, we want to pick up on a thesis of the German teacher of spiritual wisdom, Eckhart Tolle, which might provide no less an understanding than the other teachings of who created evil and why it happened. By the way, Eckhart Tolle does not consider himself committed to any tradition or doctrine in the sense of a worldview. At the end of this podcast, you will find a short, understandable summary of the thesis. Let us move on to his thesis of who created evil, which he begins with the question, if God's being is the creative source of all energy and thinking, including the negative energy we derive from the ego, then shouldn't all energy and thought, including negative thought, come from God's being? So, did God create evil? So let's take another look at it. There can only be one source, and that is the creative source of all power if being or God is the source of all creative energy. Negative energy exists in the form of thoughts, yet if thoughts are energy, then wouldn't negative thoughts come from being? That question, of course, is similar to those asked and discussed by many philosophers, and it has remained a stumbling block in the Christian religion. So let us see what the intuitive response is. In this sense, perceived, the most appropriate thing to compare God to in this sense perceived universe would be the sun, because the sun is the source of seemingly inexhaustible energy and the giver of life. Yes, the heat in your body is derived indirectly from the sun. Of course, the sun is not eternal, but in comparison to the human lifespan, it can be considered virtually endless and so much faster. And it freely gives of itself millions of years of pure energy. Let us say the sun is becoming conscious of itself because my intuition is that the universe, or rather that which underpins the universe, or the one behind the many, is becoming conscious of itself in time, the dimension time. The one also exists in the timeless dimension, where there is no past or future. So there is God, to use that word for a moment. God is already complete and perfect in the timeless, but it appears that God is becoming conscious of time through all these life forms. There are light particles which are about to become aware of the sun. They are also called photons, which may be particles. But nobody knows exactly what they really are. Waves, particles, or both. The sun constantly emits zillions of photons, or light particles, as it evolves into consciousness. Assume that each photon is a natural part of becoming aware of the sun. The individual photon's consciousness would naturally change during this process, and new awareness would emerge. It is a component of the sun that becomes conscious as this new consciousness emerges and perceives itself as a separate entity. It no longer accepts its oneness with the sun because it becomes conscious. Still, if there is a continuum, it never truly loses contact with the sun and is only a temporary part of the process of becoming conscious. It considers itself to be a separate entity, but it is only temporary. And while believing itself to be separated, it creates a variety of illusions that reflect the fundamental illusion of separateness, which is where we are in the humanities. Humanity, the human being, is the photon, the sun particle. In other words, not them, but the inner intelligence, the inner consciousness, that is, God's consciousness. This is the only consciousness. This consciousness misreceives itself during the process of becoming the whole, and this creates the illusion of separateness in the individual human being, as well as the illusion of identification with form, which is the illusion of separateness that we even see as separate beings. And the stronger the illusion, the more reflected in their actions that deceive them. That is called evil. In the end, nothing is destroyed in evil. The essence of all living beings is eternal. However, it is not comfortable at its level. From a broader perspective, it's just a short dream episode during which one becomes conscious. So that is the answer to the question of whether God created evil. So while the teachings that say evil is ultimately not real are correct, it's just a matter of how the planes appear. On some level, it has a certain reality. And just because it ends up not being real doesn't mean it doesn't seem very real on that temporary level, which it does, but it does need to be recognized as evil. The illusion can be defined as full identification with the form that I had to find somewhere before. And the more identified a being is with the form, the more apparent evil it creates, and the more suffering it causes. Of course, what is the answer? Why are we here? We have arrived, you and me. We are witnessing the emergence of the answer, which is not only the answer, but also the end of the illusion of separateness, and the end of so-called evil. In summary, this thesis of Eckhart Tolle is assumed from consciousness in the sun. Consequently, the light particles ejected by the sun are saturated by consciousness. These light particles, also called photons, change their consciousness under certain conditions and consider themselves separated from the sun. Consequently, the more this separation is perceived, the more it manifests itself in actions that we name evil, which is considered authentic at the present level. By manifestation, then, one could understand that the evil in man expresses itself through these specific particles of light, that is, in some people, or more precisely, through their actions. What do you think of this thesis? Does it sound acceptable to you and could explain why evil and suffering exist in the world? Feel free to write it in the comment section. If you enjoyed today's podcast, don't hesitate to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new episode. We would appreciate it very much. Thank you, and see you soon on our channel.